The Kingdom of Italy had been relying on the aging Chamlot-Delvin revolvers since just after unification. By 1889, the time had come for a lighter and more rugged sidearm. One preferably of native design. Or at least, one they could call native. Hi, I'm Othais, and this is the Italian Revolver Modello 1889 Bodeo. That's a mouthful, but let's get it over to Lightbox. This handier revolver is a mere 2.1 pounds in weight and just 9.1 inches long. Yes, those are improved measurements. Its 6-round cylinder loads the 10.4mm Italian Ordnance cartridge through an Adaby-style gate. More on that in a moment. Setting the Bodeo aside for 1 second, let's step back. Italy, before, like we said in the intro, was running with the Chamlot-Delvin 1874, which was basically a copy of the French's earlier revolver. These models we'll cover in more detail later, don't worry, they survived World War I, we'll get them into the show. The thing we need to know right now in order to talk about the Bodeo, though, is that the Chamlot-Delvin was a single and double action revolver that had a fairly complicated internal action. And we'll see remnants of it in other designs going forward. It's actually fairly common action, but there's just small fiddly bits that Italy felt that they could get away from. It did, however, introduce the 10.4 by 23mm rimmed cartridge. Now, in 1874, this was loaded with, black powder and a lead bullet. The lead bullet would be replaced in 1890 with a jacketed one, and in 1899 we're going to see the introduction of smokeless powder, and that required a little bit of filler. Due to unburnt powder, the bullet was reshaped to keep seal with the cylinder and better engage the rifling with less friction, keeping the velocity high. It was actually quite well thought out. In 1880, the Glisenti model appeared, which was a lightened, shortened Chamlot-Delvin meant for police and civilian sales. This revolver came in two forms. One we'd recognize just fine, but the other was meant to maximize the lightness and portability of the full-frame gun. Here, it includes a folding trigger, which had been on simple Belgian pocket revolvers for some time now. We'll get into the benefits of that in just a moment. For those of you who saw our Ruby episode, you're probably aware that certain countries weren't always great with international patents, and Italy was no exception at that time. So when I say that a civilian by the name of Carlo Bodeo invented this gun, what I really mean is that Bodeo, a man for whom we have almost no biographical data, came forward with 3 patents that amalgamated a number of ideas that were already out there in the ether into one revolver. Still good ideas, though. The first covered the simplified V-spring, a radical improvement over the Chamlot-Delvin. It greatly reduced the number of parts necessary in the revolver, bringing it to a minimum. By the way, the overall shape of Bodeo's revolver would really be stolen straight from the Glisenti model. It's lighter and shorter and thinner, yada yada yada, and it's the overall same profile, and it's going to feature 2 types of trigger. It's the Glisenti model, externally. Now, internally, he had a wholly original idea, like we said, of that simplified V-spring, except for the fact that Jean Warnant had a patent out for it in a single-action revolver some 10 years sooner. So congratulations, Bodeo, for making it double-action, however, it's very clear that these are the same design. Also included on the Bodeo was the Adaby gate loading system, which obviously was invented by somebody else, since I'm calling it the Adaby gate loading system. We'll show you it in detail in a moment. Also, the gun features, unique compared to the earlier Glisenti and Chamlot-Delvin, a pull-out and rock-over ejector rod. We'll show it up close in just a second. This would be truly unique, if it weren't for the French Model 1885, which the Italians were no doubt aware of. Are you seeing a pattern here? Anyway, regardless of where the ideas came from, they were uniquely fitted to one gun, and they were all generally good ideas. Although I might dispute the overall shape of the revolver, the Italians would actually end up nicknaming it the Leg of Lamb. Now, the Italian army was perfectly willing to adopt this gun, though, because when Bodeo introduced it as a solid concept, it worked well, it was lighter than the Chamlot-Delvin, It was cheaper to produce than the Chamelot Delvine, and it was more reliable than the Chamelot Delvine because of the simplification of the parts inside. And truly, when we get to the animation, you will see this is an incredibly simple revolver. And for that alone, it has great merits. But before we get there, let's take a closer look at just what makes up this gun. First things first, let's go ahead and cover that this is indeed a single and double action revolver. So for those of you who are unfamiliar, single action is pull back and release. Double action is the ability to pull all the way through and have it drop for you. The gun loads from a gate on the right side. Now, this is an Adobe system, so that means when I turn this back, it's now blocked the hammer. We'll talk about that in just a second. The animation will really show it. But what it means is that I can now pull the trigger and the hammer is no longer in play, making it safe to load and unload the revolver and not have to manually turn the cylinder. This is a big step above that Revolver. Also above that Revolver is that we can pull out this ejector rod, flip it over, and it lines up just right. Oop, if I pull the trigger, that is. It lines up just right to eject. So we can click, push, click, push. Now I'm doing this for the camera, but you can actually get pretty fast when you're practicing on your own, and also when you would normally put this in your left hand and do the rod with your right. I'm just trying to keep it in camera. Disassembly of the gun is extremely simple, assuming that you don't have the one particular problem that this one has. We're going to talk about that later in the episode. So let's just switch her out for a second. This is a post-war refurbished Spanish-made one. Again, you're going to learn all this as we go through the episode, but for now, just know that this one's a little looser to work with. So if I flip her over, we're going to see that we don't have a takedown screw. I mean, it is a screw, but it's sort of like a half wing nut. No tools are required for disassembling the Bodeo. So if we rotate that out, the plate is going to come away. You'll notice that the screw itself is captive, which is great. We don't want small pieces on a battlefield. If we pop this grip out, again, another large piece, not a small one. And we pretty much have complete access to the system. By the way, this sort of gap in here is where the original design had room for an ampule of oil, but it wasn't included with the adoption. You'll see simple spring, simple hammer. There's no spur. If you see that there's a little guy mounted on the hand right here, that's our hammer safety, hammer block. Don't worry about it yet. We're going to get there in just a moment. It was added later, so pretend it's not there as far as 1889 goes. By the way, there is a rebound safety on these. It's sort of not necessary at this point because we have the hammer block, but the way it works is that there's a tab on the lower spring arm that will push the base of the hammer back, so it kind of partially recocks the hammer a tiny bit. That's just a hammer rebound. That was added in, I believe, 1894. It was added retroactively, though. All it took was swapping the springs out, so you're very unlikely to find one without that safety, unless it's an officer's model. Get there in a moment. The rebound didn't work out that great. Again, we'll get there in a second, but just know that it was a later addition, but not that late. As we're looking at it, we need to keep going for disassembly, though, so I'm going to pull the rod out. I'm going to twist it over, and then I'm going to pull on this cylinder here. Not the cylinder for the gun, but rather a captive cylinder at the front that is threaded through the center of the cylinder we think of when we think of a revolver. There we go. So I've pulled him out. Now he is captive. This screw's keeping him there. He's got a little spring set. So he stays here. He's one less part to lose. If we open the gate on the other side, we can now free our cylinder. Ta-da, we are disassembled. Look at how many captive pieces there are. Look how few pieces there are overall to take care of. This is a great design in terms of being able to take care of it in the field. All right, at this point, I'm getting dangerously close to talking about details that are better covered in the animation and also updates that are better covered in the service life of the gun. So I'm going to take a step back and we're going to talk about this little guy and why there are two different models that you'll commonly see of these, plus some others. First up is the Trooper's model with the folding trigger. In 1915, this would retroactively become known as the Type A. Now, this gun was really for general issue. It was meant to go to anybody that might need a handgun that wasn't necessarily an officer. So, really wide a field. It included the folding trigger in order to save weight and material, but also, realistically, it acted like a rudimentary safety. Early holsters, early mindset, we have that whole keep the finger off the trigger mentality now, But as you draw this gun, you'll notice that the trigger is going to stay down and rested against a nice little spring that's inletted there so it doesn't scratch up the frame or dent itself. And then only once we manage to twist it up is it going to be really available to use. So in a way, it sort of unconsciously keeps you from, fingering that trigger when you're not supposed to be. Point, then shoot. Works out fairly well, although it's a bit of a pain in the butt to go chasing it around. Anyway, the Type A's were left in the white, which is why this dingy little guy is actually a better example than our nice dark blue post-war example. These guns are going to be, fairly broadly issued. The Navy's going to adopt them as well, although they'll have, 20 extra millimeters on the barrel just so that they can be different and beat the Navy. Also, the Navy is really going to be more conservative with their numbers, so as a matter of fact, a lot of the earlier Chamelot Delvines are going to be updated to have the internals from a Bodeo, including many of them being trimmed and set with a folding trigger design. But that's a story for another day. Next up is the officer's model, which would be renamed to Type B in 1915. With a standard trigger and trigger guard, it was also finished in a fine blue. It was issued to officers and other general staff in infantry, artillery, engineering, medical, veterinarian, transport, all the way down to accounting. Basically, just don't be a grunt. Cavalry would come around later, actually, because at first it retained the Chamelot Delvine, favoring the large, heavy frame and long barrel for stability while firing from the saddle. Now, I don't actually have a Type B on me. Sorry guys, I can't go around purchasing everything and we didn't have one to borrow. But you saw the picture, so you know what it's doing. It's not hard to imagine. The Type Bs were also used by the Financial Guard and the police, although there's a whole sub-history for those that's rather fascinating. The first ones were externally Type B Bodeos. Internally, they were still not Glacentes, but rather Chamelot Delvines on the inside. The reason for this is most likely because as a civilian organization, they were more prone to be sued for violating those international patents. In other words, because the Financial Guard and the police avoid the Bodeo internals at first, we kind of get an idea that the Italians knew that they were getting away with it. There's also some other submodels that'll come out. We'll get to those in just a moment. But let's go ahead and talk about with the Type A and Type B, the guns that are going to be in World War I, the subject of our series. Who made those? Production began with the Royal Arms Factory Brescia, Regia Fabbrica d'Armi di Brescia. I'm terrible at Italian. They produced the Type A from 1889 until 1891, and the Type B from 91 until 93. Glacenti took up production of the Type A in 1890, but halted. Then the Type B in 1891, the Type A resumed in 1896, and both lasted until 1906, although production was rather scant and fell off sharply after 1898. Now, inspection and serialization of the Bodeo would be handled at Brescia centrally, so pretty much from now until much later in the game, anybody producing it, not just these two companies, but more that we'll name in a moment, they're going to send their guns over to Brescia, they're going to be inspected, and then they're going to be serialized. Now, the Type Bs being private purchases, there's no real reason to serialize them, so their internal manufacturer markings are really the only way to keep track of them. Officers were expected to just take care of their own dang guns. So, with those guns getting dates and production numbers, it's actually really hard because there's not a lot of survey information to go off of. Anyway, these guns would be produced right up until about 1898 with, some sense of urgency, but it dies off rapidly because the Navy's looking at the C-96. There's some other semi-automatic designs coming into the market. The Italians are going, are we really going to keep making these? And we certainly have enough for right now. We're an army at rest. That's not going to last forever, though, because, as we're so familiar with, war were declared. Although not that war. This is the Italo-Turkish War. Beginning in 1911, this conflict was half ancient, half modern. It was actually kind of interesting to look at. We're not going to go into detailed history, so I really encourage you all to do some reading on this. Hit Wikipedia, hit some books. It's fantastically interesting. Futurists at the time would have seen some really interesting things coming out because it was some early use of combined arms and featured the first aerial bombardment when an Italian pilot dropped grenades from his plane on an enemy line. It also gave Mustafa Kemal a chance to make a name for himself. He's going to be really important in World War I. Head over to the Great War channel if you don't know why. Anyway, not having a source for more revolvers suddenly became an acute worry for the Italians, so production was begun again. Toschi e Castelli, not to be confused with Takeshi's Castle, began in 1911 and would last through 1919, although the company would change names to Mida Ghia Castelli and then Mida Brescia. Here it stands for Manifattura Italiana d'Armi. Again, I don't speak any other freaking languages. Mida had things covered until, World War I, and as we know, that cluster something was really eating up men and weapons in every direction. So, production had to begin again. Unfortunately, Mida and others were busy with, rifles and other things that were needed for the front, and the revolver was sort of secondary. So, Italy would have to do a lot like the French and turn to the not-so-distant Eibar region in Spain and ask for help. Thankfully, though, the Bodeo was really already ready to be made by Spanish small-time manufacturers. I mean, it's extremely simple in design and uses fairly soft metal. So, we're straightforward out the gate, ready to go. And 3 manufacturers would be brought in to ship these things straight to Italy. Here we have Antonio Aresti, I can't speak Spanish, Salvador Estegui, Chewbacca, Arizmendi and Goenaga. Pedro Goenaga would leave in 1917, which means some of these will be marked Francisco Arizmendi. As with earlier models, these would be inspected and serialized at the arsenal in Brescia. While serviceable, the Spanish copies are usually cruder with looser actions. Post-war, many of these would be refurbished at Sezione della Fabbrica d'Armi del Regio Esercito. That means the original marks were ground away and they were restamped, plus they were blued. The year of remanufacture will be listed on the right side. Most will say 1925 or 1926. Finally, Bernardelli would produce the last run. These were new made from scratch and came out in 2 batches, 1928 and 1930. They were tight, highly polished pieces. Bluing was a little heavy. However, Bernardelli Bodeos tend to be in really good shape when you find them. Now, as far as Type A's and Type B's go, that's going to be all the manufacturers, except for the mystery ones. You see, the Italian officers were required to buy their own handguns, like we said, which is why they weren't serialized. But they weren't necessarily cheap, and I don't know the exact numbers, especially compared to salary at the time. I do know, however, that they had a payment plan. So for those of you who have to sort of lease your own equipment or buy your own uniforms, you may know this pain. They were charged a portion of the cost of the revolver every month from their pay until it was paid off. Now, Italians being thrifty people, they found other sources for Type B revolvers. And so, there are some that are found with absolutely no markings, and some that are found with just Liège proofs. They're quite rare, so if you have one, please let us know. We'd love to see one. It appears that the original manufacturers didn't want to be identified, though, because then they could be nailed for the patent problems. Anyway, these guns turned up enough at their time that there was even a memo released by the Italian army that basically was to the effect of, hey, if it doesn't have Brescia inspection stamps on it, you probably might not want to rely on it to save your life. Anyway, if you have one of these guns that's blank, you should also take a little bit of care because it may not have been properly inspected or refurbished at any point. Okay, with all that aside, I think it's probably about time that we get a look at the animation and get the gun over to Mae. First, let's open up that loading gate and load the revolver. Note the gate has an extension holding the nose back, preventing the seer from cocking the hammer. So each pull of the trigger just rotates the cylinder, easing loading. We can use the gun in single action by simply drawing the hammer back, and then pulling the trigger. Note the single V spring powers the hammer, trigger, balances the hand, and presses the rear of the hammer to create a rebound safety. It's truly a great system in terms of simplicity. In double action, the seer lifts the nose, attached to the hammer. That nose is hinged so that on the release it allows the seer to pass. To clear the spent casings, we'll open the gate again and pull the ejector rod out and rotate it, quickly pressing it to the rear. Alright, let's get Mae to show this thing off.
We'll load up 6 shots using the Adobe gate. Single action. And double. Now let's slow that down. And we'll unload slightly faster than the Revolver. Finally, let's see that target. You know, all things considered, I'll take it. Back to Othais.
Now we have to thank Mae for making this gun run, because we had quite a few problems with it on the range, mostly stemming from some historical problems with the design itself. Let's get a closer look. Alright, so we've borrowed our refinish one because it disassembles easier anyway. First up with Mae, we were having some problems with this. By the way, this is not a pin set hammer like the other one. This one's formed. It just wasn't striking quite well. I think it's gotten a little short over the years. That's just one minor issue. The bigger issue, though, was with the AROSTEGUI system, and the Italians would note this as well at times, although there wasn't really a strong fix for it. So if I get her back apart, which doesn't take too long, and we take a look, remember from our animation that when we engage the AROSTEGUI system, we now have the nose, and I'm sorry my fingers are so big, but the nose is pressed down into the hammer now. Well, that little tab in there is quite small. And once it's back, if you start forcing on this or you drop it while loading or something like that, you can start bending it up. And if it gets malformed in there, it can get in the way of the hammer even when it's up. It'll start to snag as the hammer comes down, preventing fire. We were having that problem. It was deformed in there. I had to strip the whole gun down and bend it back out and shape it back up to get it to operate properly. The other thing is, if the AROSTEGUI system gets crushed, you can presume that your gun is not wiggling the hammer anymore and pull that trigger while loading and put a round through your foot. So it's not a very good flaw to have. Double check your AROSTEGUI system, folks. The other problems with the gun are that the barrels were screwed in and not always soldered up very well. So over time, they can start to come loose. We did not have that problem, thankfully. And, you know, it's sort of a minor issue because you just got to solder it and screw it back in. The other things that would go on with the gun are the screw here that retains that collar. Well, they tend to be over tight on some models. As a matter of fact, this one here, which actually does belong to Jay, our wonderful gun wrangler and ammo loader, you might be able to see some punch marks here. You would think that this is the hand of Bubba, but a lot of these Italian revolvers show these marks right here, especially when they have over-tight screws. So it appears that the soldiers themselves were taking whacks at it to get it out. As a matter of fact, I can't get it out without a plastic punch. So we're not going to do this one on camera. But if you have, you know, an in the white, kind of beat up looking, especially with punch marks here, Bodeo, don't sweat it too much. You actually have a World War I correct one. All right. Other issues are going to include the fact that even with the rebound, and mind you, we have the solution already on this gun, so I can't demonstrate it, but even on the rebound, if you drop the gun, you could override the pressure of the spring and still discharge a round by dropping the revolver from a good height. This was enough of a problem that the Italians decided to address it. They tried two methods, and one finally sunk in. But let's get to the earlier one first. That was the Delauzo method. An external spring was set on the left side of the action. When the trigger was forward, it sat flush, and its L-shaped top blocked the hammer from moving forward. When the trigger was pulled, the sear would press on a lug low on that spring, and it pushed it out of the frame, away from the frame, causing the spring to bend out of the path of the hammer. While it did work, this system was an extreme snag risk and could easily become caked with dirt or damaged. It was introduced around 1894, 1895, but would be phased out by 1906. That sounds like a long time for it to be in place, but that production period was very limited. So few were made and fewer more exist because most would be refurbished during the war and after to the second method. This would be the vitello method. Now, the Navy adopted this with the safety free-floated and riding over the mainspring, but the much more common Army model like we have here today, it's mounted to the hand. We can see it pretty clearly here. Unfortunately, I gotta find a way to get it to the camera. So if I cock this hammer back, she'll pop out and we can see her. So this little guy right there that is attached to our hand rises, okay, when the hand rises. And the hand stays up the entire time we pull the trigger through. And that's good because what they've done is they've set a notch high on the hammer so that the hammer cannot fall through the tab. And sorry guys, this didn't show on the animation very well, but you can see it here in my big fingers. It's that little tab that's snaking off to the right, that little extension on the right. That guy blocks the hammer when it's down in the action. I'll lower it in just a second. When it's up, it meets up with this gap in the hammer. So if I have the hammer down, I cannot shove it forward. There's a piece of metal blocking me. If I pull the trigger all the way through, however, all the way through, let her down, and hold her. Oh, I gotta hold her while spinning her. There we go. You can see she's made it up to the gap in the hammer. And that's it. It's a pretty simple system. A couple milling operations and you slap it right in. She's good to go. This would be the most widely adopted method, and it would be, done to most of the pieces retroactively. I should say that any DeLauzo that did not break was not replaced. So if you have a DeLauzo on your gun, good. They weren't universally refurbished. The problem is they did just tend to break a lot or snag a lot. So it's really more common to see this later vitello safety. Unless you have a Type B. Now, Type Bs might lack the vitello safety. They might lack the DeLauzo safety. They might lack the rebound spring. So if you have a Type B, I wouldn't recommend it as a concealed carry until you inspect it. The reason for this is because the Italians had sold them personally to those officers. So, good old Italian system, we made you pay for it, it's defective, but we still don't really want to fix it because then we won't get to keep the money. So they just thought, these guys are educated, they probably won't shoot their feet off, let's just roll with it. Be careful. While we're still talking about problems with this gun, I should probably get to the last thing. It's sort of one of the more major ones. This is an iron frame revolver. A lot of people don't realize that. It's not steel. The barrel is steel, the cylinder is steel, the lockwork is steel. Frame, iron. And that's going to lead to some problems. Especially with the introduction of smokeless powder, we're going to see some deforming around that sort of mouth where the hammer is going through the frame. The casings are going to set back in there, and they're going to cause the cylinder to not want to rotate when the trigger is pulled. So, the Italians came up with a fairly decent solution for this. All they had to do was, remove the lockwork for one, drill in from the back, and tap and screw in a steel plug, right behind that main cylinder, and then mill it back out so that the hammer could pass through. They would then grind and refinish, and as a matter of fact, you're very hard-pressed to be able to tell if it's been done to yours or not without getting the old magnifying glass out. The easiest way to tell would probably be just to get a good look at the face of it and see if it has any real distortion to it. It's going to be a little oblong. Don't be afraid of that. It's whether or not you have a nice sharp edge there and any sort of pitting right where that cartridge is striking that backplate. Okay, at this point I need to take a timeout and cover one more model because a lot of you are going to be confused if you own one because we haven't said anything about it yet, and that's really a non-military lightened model. These handy little Type B variants were sold commercially and favored by police, but they really are best served by another story another time. They were produced by Fabbrica d'Armi di Roma, MBT, which is Metallurgica Bresciana Gli Tempini, and the good old Napoleon e Vittorio Castelli. Getting back to our main interests, the military Bodeos, the Type B really wasn't produced all that much after 1906, if at all. There's not a lot of data for Type Bs. The Type A, though, it kept soldiering on like we said. I mean, we're being produced by Bernardelli up to 1930. Now, look at what's come out in that time period. You have the Navy adopting the C-96. You have Army-Navy experiments with the Glicenti 1910, the Brixia 1912. You have the Beretta 1915, the Beretta 1917. After the war, we have the 1919. We go into all sorts of experiments, and we come out the other end with the excellent Beretta 34 and then Beretta 35. These are all great Italian handguns, and a lot of them are inexpensive to make. And yet we still have the Bodeo. It's still right there. It's serving now with NCOs and MPs. It's serving out in the colonies, but it's serving. And it goes through World War II. And it sticks around, honestly, into the 60s. And it sticks around, honestly, because, yes, Italy had poor industrial capacity. Italy could not replace pieces like these easily with semi-automatic handguns. That's true. Italy was more determined to have an empire than it had the capacity to arm the empire. But these kept working. I mean, you can't stretch the Bodeo unless the Bodeo works. And it does. The few problems were easily resolved. You are talking about a black powder 40 caliber iron-framed revolver, the last of its generation, and probably one of the best of its generation, but right at the cusp of smokeless. And yet, it goes all the way through World War II, and it functions. Yes, it's not the perfect handgun. Yes, Mae's going to give us some opinions on just a moment about this leg of lamb pattern. But it works. And so, in that regard, it's kind of one up on the Gewehr 88 in that it combined the best ideas at the time, and then it lasted. The Gewehr 88 didn't even manage to last, really. So, I give it a lot of love. I think that, these guys turn up as really inexpensive and unpopular collector's items, and I think that's kind of sad because they are truly fascinating. I love the Bodeo. But I should say one last thing. If you want one little salvation for its World War II role, it had one advantage, just one sneaky little advantage over the pistols. And that is that it was the only Italian revolver, and therefore it was the only thing welcome with the tank crews, because you didn't want hot casings flying around in there. All right, I'm going to hand this off to Mae and see how she really feels about it. Maybe she won't be so wistful as I am. All right, we made some room. We brought in the Mae. If you guys don't know the routine by now, I can't help you. If this is your first episode, it's a weird one to start on. All right, so let's get down to business. I want you to talk to us about the Bodeo, starting with, I guess, the ergonomics, the feel.
So first off, let's take a look at this gun. It actually looks awkward. I mean, it's big and it doesn't look like it'll be that comfortable, but this lamb's leg grip, actually fairly comfortable. It's got this steep grip that fits right into the palm of your hand. The only thing I wish they did was, I wish they'd actually flared it out here at the bottom a little bit, but beggars can't be choosers. The actual weight of this gun, it helped a lot with the recoil, I felt. However, the high bore axis actually caused it to whip up a little bit, so that made it a little difficult to manage. But it did save itself with the U-notch sights. These are actually fairly easy to read, so when I brought it down, I was able to realign fairly quickly. And one thing I failed to mention was that it actually feels like it almost has a natural point of aim with this grip. So it feels like when you want to point it, that it just naturally wants to line up straight in your hand. It's actually really comfortable.
Yeah, I think anybody that hasn't handled a Bodeo would be surprised. You look at it, actually, Mae.
Yeah.
It's definitely dated, right? Well, it's awkward, it's lumpy. However, if we really pay attention to just the grip, that rake, it's almost like a target pistol or a Luger or a little steeper than a 1911. So if I hold this level and I merge my hand in and close up my grip, I'm still level. I haven't twisted it up or down in order to settle my grip. The only problem with that is, just like Mae said, I'm way at the rear of the gun. The gun is heavy, but remember, that's the iron frame. It's all in the middle, so the weight is not at the barrel. And the barrel is very high. So I'm at the back, I'm low, the barrel's high, it's not a very heavy barrel, it's heavy at the center of balance, and maybe even to the rear. So we're going to get a little whip. And we're going to have to shove her back down because the weight's not carrying the day. The weight wants to carry our whole arm down. It doesn't want to lower the barrel as much. But it's a little bit of a balance issue. It's not a revolver killer balance issue. It's the only awkward thing about it. And when you look at this, you would imagine there'd be 8 more awkward things about it. All right, so handling aside, how is shooting the thing?
For a revolver, the Bodeo was actually a little difficult. This trigger itself right here, it's incredibly heavy. It reminds me of the Russian Nagant revolver. But the pull-through itself was fairly even all the way through. I will say, though, single action for this revolver was incredibly difficult, mostly just because I don't know where to put my pointer finger. Because if I put it up front, I feel that it's going to actually like pull on the trigger a little bit. If I put it behind, notice when you pull the hammer back, and I'm sure Othais' animation showed you, it actually moves, so it almost wants to pinch your finger. And then I can't put my finger up here because rotating cylinder. So it's just a little awkward to handle. The cartridge itself was actually all right. It was big and slow, I could tell that. Kind of reminds me of 455 Webley, which was actually fairly nice.
We should say that both 455 Webley and the Bodeo are large-bore, slow-moving cartridges. However, the 455 has some significant performance advantages we'll get into later. However, shooting it as a shooter, big gun, that sort of throaty boom, they're pretty comparable. I would say that shooting a 455 Webley and shooting the Bodeo, not entirely different. The ergonomics are different, the revolvers are different, the handling's different. But just that cartridge, that boom, that's pretty similar. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's see. We've talked about handling, we've talked about shooting. I think we should probably take a time out and talk about loading and unloading.
So going to load this gun, it actually was a little bit awkward because I have to, of course, first put it in my non-dominant hand to use it. But the actual Adabeat system itself, I thought it was good for its time. Like, this was great for when it came out because before this was the Revolver. And then when you think about it, the swing open cylinders that came out, like the French Revolver, the 1892, those didn't come out for another 2 years. So this was great for its time. But yeah, you pull the gate back and, of course, pull out the ejector rod. And it's fairly simple. Just pull the trigger, pop the ejector rod. Pull trigger, pop ejector rod. And it stows away. Like, it's a great system, honestly, I thought, in my opinion.
Yeah, from a modern context, awkward. We get it. But this isn't the first Adabeat she's used. We just haven't gotten to the video of that yet. So, it works. It works better than the other options of that day. However, we all know with hindsight that just 2-3 years down the road, boom, we're going to have swing out cylinders. And those are a huge step forward. But the only way they can be a huge step forward if that, there was another attempt at a maximally efficient system that just didn't work anything like it. And that's this. This was the previous, before the swing out cylinder, this is it. The Adabeat system is the best you're going to get until you actually start swinging cylinders out. So appreciate it for what it is in its time. In 1889, just like we said, we like this as an amalgam revolver that brings in the best ideas. It's sort of like the Gewehr 88 of revolvers. That doesn't mean that it's future-proof, though. If you're taking the best ideas of the current generation, you're not working in new ideas for the next generation. So you're not going to be revolutionary. You're just going to be, it's a good choice. It's a good choice to choose the best proven technology for a military force. However, no risk, no reward. All right, I guess we're down to that last question. How would you feel about taking this gun into battle? And when I say battle, we are always talking about World War I. Remember, the gun's from 1889. We are talking about 1914. So, 1914, how's the Bodeo holding up?
For 1914, I'm going to have to say no. There were better options out there. I mean, by 1914, this was big and awkward. The trigger itself was incredibly heavy, like we talked about. The cartridge was dated. If you noticed on range, the target hits, they were a bit wide, just because of the trigger pull itself. And then, overall, you didn't get to see this, but we had a couple of misfires on range, so while we only had 2 models to pull from, I don't trust it. I just don't find it that reliable. So 1900, sure, I would have tested it out. I would have tried it. 1914, I just had better options. However, that being said, as a collector, I think these are gorgeous pieces, and I would love to collect them until the day I died.
I'd agree with most of that, except for that last point. I don't know about gorgeous. In my mind, if you don't... But I would collect every version of the Bodeo in a heartbeat. I think they're delightful. But I think they're delightful like I think a pug is delightful. They're snorty and weird, and they have misshapen qualities, but they still somehow get around and do what they're supposed to do. What are pugs supposed to do?
I don't know, pug things?
Okay. Anyway, so while we're on the topic of the Bodeo and loving them and collecting them, I want to say one thing very clearly. Check the comments for this video. We got a hold of a fairly new book. It's written in Italian, I'm sorry to say, but there's lots of pretty pictures, there's lots of dates, and some of you could stand to punch some things into Google Translate. If you have any interest in collecting these, do not rely on us alone as your source. There's a lot more to know about these. I highly recommend the book. I'm not going to butcher the author's name. Check the link. If you don't care about collecting Bodeos or learning more about them, then I can't help you. But if you do, that's it. That's your source. Before that, in any language, there's barely anything out there. So that is the gold standard. Go get it. And also, it's not through our Amazon store because it's not in English, so I don't even get a penny. I'm just telling you that it's a great book. That's about it, though, so I guess we should probably wrap it out. Any additional updates will be after the credits, so we thank you all for watching.
Thanks, guys.
Alright, boys and girls, this is audio only because we're running behind again, but just a couple things real quick. One, don't get too excited for the DrakeGmbH just yet. Our range is underwater again. So while we're trying to deal with that, we're going to have to wait. I know that's annoying, but I have 5 rounds to work with, and reasonably I want to give you guys the best product possible, so every little delay just means that we get more appropriate steel to shoot at, we get more appropriate targets otherwise, we have better ideas, we're getting the lighting together. Obviously, you can tell that we've been experimenting with high speed. We're going to do this right, okay? And I'm sorry that's going to take a little bit longer, but I know you guys will appreciate having the best possible product, especially with something that we can't really reshoot easily. Let's see. Oh, also, make sure you comment well wishes to May. She has managed to catch cold again. So she was sort of powering through on this episode. You might be able to tell it in her voice. As a matter of fact, that one blackout in the middle of filming her segment was that she had to take a break for a coughing fit and we had to start over. So let's give her a lot of love. Other than that, Patreon's up. It's at like 11:10. Although, just so you guys know, when it charges at the end of the month, there's some failures and then it readjusts our amount. So at this point where we're at, every month it seems like we lose $150 to $200 when the first rolls around. Don't be too startled by seeing that. That's because of their new estimation system. It basically, anybody who didn't get their charges put through, it cycles them back out on the next month. So there's some adjusting there. But we're growing slowly but surely, and we appreciate every dang dollar. And with that, I should probably say that the field trips are lined up. We're going to go film out our machine guns in the later half of March. We have another trip further up into the Northeast scheduled for April, which will bring in lots of great photos and reference images and things like that. That's sort of a surprise for you guys. And as you can tell, we've got a lot of experiments going on with the high speed. So, with that, hopefully you guys will be entertained. I'm also going back through and reworking the old animations from the earlier episodes so that they loop. And I'm going to try to get them uploaded on the off weeks so that you guys can enjoy those on their own. Hopefully that's going well. If there's any other concerns or suggestions, by all means, let me know. And we'll continue to try to get you guys the best show possible. All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.